Hey, all, it's Peter. I wanted to let you know something that I'm really excited about. The Orthodox Presbyterian Church, the OPC, is exploring a new church plant in central Orange County in the Tustin or Irvine area, of which I'm part of. We're gathering interest for an informational session about this church plant and upcoming Bible studies. If you or someone you know is interested, go to our show notes, click the link OPC and the OC on top, and subscribe for our updates. Please share this with your friends and family. Anyone who's looking for a confessionally reformed, evangelistically minded church in the heart of Orange County. I hope to meet you soon.
Hey everybody, this is Pastor Danny Hyde from the Oceanside United Reformed Church. I want to invite you out to our church. We meet in sunny Southern California, here in San Diego, and we meet at the Army Navy Academy in Carlsbad, right along the ocean, as you can see, the Pacific. And we meet every Sunday at 10 o'clock in the morning. We hear the Word of God, we hear the gospel preached. We have the Lord's Supper every Sunday morning, and then we have Sunday school at about noon for kids. We come again together at 5 o'clock every night, Sunday night, for teaching, prayer, and singing. And then we also have various midweek groups, Bible studies, men's, women's, and also other Bible studies as well throughout the week. So I want to invite you out to worship with us. If you know anybody in the area here in North County of San Diego, invite them as well. Let them know. You can find out more about us on our website, oceansideurc.org, or also on all the various social media. You'll find us as well. God bless.
Hello, everyone. Once again, it's the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast, where we bridge the gap to reform Christian theology for your listening pleasure. And as Nick Fulweiler, my co-host, my esteemed co-host, likes to say, even though he's not on here today, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. And we have our book club episode. We have two authors of the three authors for this book called Deep Reading Practices to Subvert the Vices of Our Distracted, Hostile, and Consumeristic Age. And we have Julie Ooms and Rachel De Smith Roberts on this episode to talk about this book. And this is published by our good friends at Baker Academic. We've had Baker Academic books, we've had Brazos Press books, we've had Baker books, all kind of under the Baker Publishing umbrella. So we'll get into this episode in just a minute. Before we get started in this episode, make sure you go into our show notes, because in our show notes, you're actually going to find a link to this book. So if you press on the actual episode, it'll drop down with a little show note thing, and then find the area that talks about the book and the publisher. Click that book, and then pick up a copy for yourself or a copy for your friend or pastor or whoever may enjoy reading, or maybe you want them to enjoy reading more, and so you buy them this book. You want them to read deeper. I really encourage people to read this book, and you guys will see why as we get into this interview. And beyond this as well, if you want to go to our NAPARC Church Finder, so North American Presbyterian Reformed Council, if you go to our NAPARC Church Finder and you type in your zip code, automatically the nearest Reformed or Presbyterian churches will populate in your area, because we want this to drive to the local church so you can be embodied with other people, other believers, much as they talk about in this book as well. And then also our confessional podcast network. We have about 10 other podcasts of this network that we started. So if you want to hear very similar stuff to us, you can find that network as well. And then that's on confessionalpods.com. And then our website is guiltgracepod.com. So our bio, all of our episodes. If you're old school and you just want to go to a website instead of a podcast catcher, all of our episodes are there for listening and for video as well. And then on top of that, our store merchandise. So we have a shirt, we have a few mugs, and a few of the things. Not too many. I think it's 4 or 5 in total, because we don't want to overwhelm your decision-making process. And as well, on top of that, any donation that you give us, and not just buying things, any donation that you give us is tax deductible, because we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we are very thankful for any and all donations that we're given. You can also find our bridge builders in there. Our past one, and they're coming up again, is the Davenant Institutes, which is a kind of an online seminary of sorts, more of a continuing education for that as well. And then you can find us on YouTube. Just type in Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast on YouTube. If you enjoy watching me for some reason, or watching our guests, which is probably more likely than watching me. You can also find us in there. And then all of our social media tags are at guiltgracepod. And like I said, we have the two of the three authors of Deep Reading on this show. So we have both Rachel Smith or Rachel M. DeSmith Roberts and Julie Ooms, not Julie Ooms, Julie Ooms. And so I'll give you a quick little bio of them in just a sec as I look for it. So Rachel DeSmith Roberts, she is the associate professor of English at Spring, or this is Rachel Griffis. Oops, there's two Rachels, which I knew was going to get me. So Rachel DeSmith Roberts is associate professor of English at North Greenville University in Tigerville. I hope I'm saying that right. Not Tigerville. I'm assuming it's Tigerville, South Carolina. And then Julie Ooms, who is associate professor of English at Missouri Baptist University in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm going to shut up and let my guests finally talk for the first time. It's a pleasure having you both on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Of course. Yeah. Sorry for that verbal throw up for the past 2 or 3 minutes, but thanks for our audience and for you guys for bearing with me. So yeah, first question, we'll get into it since we have both of you, and maybe Julie, I'll start with you. Just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, because we heard one line that you're a professor, and I'm assuming there's more about you than just being a professor. So let's get to know you a little bit better.
Oh boy, there's a little bit more about me. Rachel and I were joking about this in the chat that we're going to have startlingly, embarrassingly similar bios past a certain point.
Okay. Yep.
I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and now of course live in St. Louis. The minute we got the message about being on your podcast, I was like, oh yes, I know what this is about, because so was Rachel, raised in Dutch Reformed circles. There's an enclave of Dutch descendants of immigrants in that part of Chicago. So very much educated in that tradition, but I've been among the Baptists since 2008 when I was in grad
we like
school.
Baptists, it's fine.
There you go. I do too. And then I've been teaching at Missouri Baptist since 2014, but that's, professor life stuff. I enjoy reading. I have cats. If I were in a different room, I would show you the lovely knitted sweater that I am blocking right now. There we go. Oh, awesome.
About 3 feet away from me.
I shut the door on mine because otherwise they would have been yelling the entire time we were recording.
It's always a joke when people watch our show because they're like, where are Peter's 2 cats in the midst of the show?
Mine are behind door number 1 over there. So, and I don't know. I like to run. I think I'll probably stop there because that's probably enough to go on.
You just annoyed all the audience that you like running. That's not like that's a thing you like doing.
I like the feeling after I'm finished running.
Okay, that's fair.
Let's go with that. Yeah.
Okay, fair.
Yeah.
Cool. Rachel, let's get to know you a little bit too.
Yeah. So I also grew up in Dutch Christian Reform circles. In my case, in Iowa. And Julie and I actually went to the same undergraduate college and the same graduate school. So one of my earlier memories of Julie is that neither of us needed to ask for an extension on our literary theory paper in undergrad, and the whole rest of the class was freaking out that they were not going to make the deadline. And we're like, we're fine. It's fine. We got this. Anyway, so that tells you something about us and our lives as college students.
Your Dutchness.
I scolded them in an email, didn't I? I sent an email.
Yes, you did.
That's funny because that is, you don't have to say you're from Dutch Reformed circles because that tells people you're from Dutch Reformed circles.
Yeah, no, that's you can cut out the whole first part of my comment and you'll get there. Yep. So I now live in South Carolina, where I teach at a small Baptist college in the Blue Ridge Mountains, or close enough to the Blue Ridge Mountains that we can say we're in the mountains, which is lovely. Let's see, non-professional stuff. I live here with my husband, Nate. We are unfortunately dog, not cat people, although we don't have a dog at the moment. So
my dog's 20 feet to my left, so I'm a dog person as well.
Excellent. Obviously, probably my favorite leisure activity is reading, which is probably why we wrote a book about reading.
I'm shocked that you guys wrote a book on reading, since you guys don't
Yeah.
like reading at all. It's wild.
Not at all.
It's weird. It's weird. But yeah, you know, I also like being outside in nature. I like playing board games. This semester I did a lot of baking for some reason. I don't know why. That's never really been a thing that I did, but now apparently I do. So
Hmm.
yeah,
I know. I think COVID did a number on people, and so now everyone's into baking after
it's
COVID.
true.
Yeah.
It is true.
Rachel and I also lived together for 2 years while we were in grad school, and I'm sad that the baking didn't strike while
I
I
know.
was
I
your
know.
roommate.
That's right. It's always the
Just
best having a roommate who bakes and who grills, and you're like, this is an awesome life.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that is good.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. We have a neighbor across the street who has a smoker. And so every once in a while there
Our
will be
neighbor right
man.
across from me.
smoke rising.
Yeah, we smoke meats probably once or twice a month. We'll bring the drinks, so our drink cabinet's
Nice.
right there.
Yeah.
But we'll bring the drinks, and then he'll bring the meats, and he has a really fancy smoker, and it's a really good time.
Oh, I bet.
Cool. So you guys talked about reading. You kind of enjoy reading, which is
Mhm.
good because you wrote a book on it. Where did the idea come for writing deep reading? It's kind of interesting writing a book on reading. It's an interesting. I think a lot of people. It's people write books on writing books, which is also like Inception. But yeah, writing a book on reading. So where did this idea come from?
Okay.
Maybe we'll just start with Julie, unless Rachel wants to start off a question.
Alphabetical order. Okay. That works for me. We saw a gap in the literature, I think, was sort of the first reason. There weren't the books that we saw that were about teaching English in Christian higher ed, which was our original audience, was kind of limited one. I think the most recent one was published in 2009, and none of them had the like practice-based approach that ours does. So I think that was sort of the impetus for that. And then also, it's just been interesting in the past, what, 5, 10 years to think about the really worldview heavy approaches that we had both been educated, or all three of us had been educated
Same here.
in, and to see, ways in which that's been challenged, or I guess supplemented by the practice-based approaches. And we saw that happening in a lot of other people's work and thought this was something we could add to the conversation.
Yeah,
Cool.
for sure. And I'll also say that I think for all of us, the motivation for the book came out of our love, not just of reading, but also of teaching reading. Again, our audience in this book is much expanded beyond teachers, but that's kind of where we started. Because when you teach reading, you talk about stuff you read all the time, and you kind of coach people into ways of approaching difficult texts, and you have to kind of bring a conversation around a text. And in doing that for all the years that we've been doing that, we really felt like that had been very formative for us. And so that dovetails really well with these conversations about practices and kind of character formation in Christian higher ed.
Yeah, that speaks to me because I went to Biola University back in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and worldview was everything whenever we read or talked or whatever it was. And whenever you're talking, like when you were talking about Christian school students, I was like, that was me for I went to Wheaton for a year and then transferred to Biola. And so I got everything that you guys were talking about in the books. Like this makes a lot of sense. And then all that was kind of questioned later on when I read Jamie Smith or other people like that who are critiquing a lot of this stuff. Yeah, and this is engaged with a lot in your guys' book. You talked about this, so there are recent books on kind of how to read, a lot on what to read, and you profile some of these throughout this work as well. And establishing a practice is reading good books towards virtuous ends. This book, however, it seems more focused on why of reading, and more particularly so in an age of distraction and fragmentation, which is already in your subtitle, but it's also big in the book. So can you describe, and again, Julie, I'll start with, actually, you know what, Rachel, I'll start with you since I started with Julie the last two. Yeah, why what's the big deal with reading right now? Why so much focus on the why of reading this when we can get all this bite-sized piece of information and kind of fill our head with all this stuff?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that is the question, right? And partly that comes from what I was just talking about, our own kind of deep love of and experiences with reading. Make us believe that reading is something that matters. It's formative, it's transformative. It also, since all of us work in Christian spaces, there's a lot of continuity between um, Christian tradition and love for the scriptures, and care taken with reading and approaches to reading. So I don't know. It all seems to be kind of part of the same thing. And we picked out, and maybe Julie wants to say more about some of these, but we picked out these three in the book. We call them kind of cultural vices: distraction, hostility, and consumerism. And we talked about reading. Actually, I think in our first draft, we said something like reading combats these things, but we did not like that aggressive language. And so we've moved a lot towards talking about reading as a remedy for these things, as something that can form us in healthier directions.
That's good. Yeah. Julie, yeah, want to add to that?
Yeah. I think I focus more on thinking about why reading in particular is the remedy for distraction and fragmentation. I think maybe self-evidently, right? Reading requires you to not be distracted because you're focusing on one thing, right?
Yeah.
You can't splinter your attention in the same way you can with a lot of other forms of media. But I think the resistance to fragmentation, that part of your question really interested me. I thought of and I'm going to forget who it is, some like Greek or Latin poem writer, Terence, maybe, the guy the "I am human, nothing human is alien to me" quote. I don't know if either of you are familiar with that. No?
It
Okay.
sounds vaguely familiar, but I couldn't pick out the poet.
Right, there you go. I can't either, so we're fine. Having to focus, especially if you're reading stories, having to imagine the lives of other people, having to think about texts and characters and authors as neighbors and not as something that you're fighting against, something that you're trying to like catch on an error or something like that. I think that's really important in terms of a remedy to fragmentation, in terms of how we view other people, helping us become more empathetic and charitable towards those we read with and those that we read about. So
yeah, that's good. Yeah, because we'll get into this in the next few sections, or at least the kind of flyovers of the next few parts. But it does seem when Christians read, we either read stuff that does agree with us or stuff that doesn't agree with us, and we read the stuff that doesn't agree with us so that we know why we don't agree with them, and that we could have more firepower to disagree with them even further, which leads into kind of the more, not necessarily consumerism, but the combative stuff. We read to combat. And so your focus is not so much on the text, on the author, on the setting, whatever it is. It's on the thing that you're trying to use that thing towards, not on the text itself.
Yeah.
That dovetails with one of the critiques of kind of the worldview, and we didn't invent this critique. Other people have done it, but that kind of coming from a worldview perspective can just make you inherently skeptical, because you're always saying, does this fit with my worldview?
Yeah.
Does this not fit with my worldview? Does this pose a danger to my worldview? Those kinds of things. And those are important questions. But if that's the only way you ever approach something, then it's very hard to be, as Julie was saying, charitable, empathetic. It's very hard to put yourself in those postures.
Yeah. I feel like it's not too dissimilar from when you're talking to a non-Christian friend and you're always told, like, you always got to find a way to evangelize them. You always got to find that little direction. And then your friend starts feeling like, am I your friend or am I a project towards a specific end? Which we treat books the same way, that this is towards an end, but not the end itself.
Yeah.
So a few a few questions on each part, kind of 30,000 foot overview. I'll get more particular and specific parts that I think we'll talk to our audience. And it's no secret that you guys have already said this, and people who are listening know this as well, that we're living in one of the most, if not the most, distracted times in history. Now there's a bill on the congressional floor on TikTok. There's all sorts of stuff. There's all sorts of distractions. There's also things moving our attention away from a written text. And if you talk to Aristotle, he wouldn't have liked the written text. He had his own critiques of the written text. So we've all we have a we have a fractured relationship with a written text. I'm not really sure what to do with it. And we're trained to develop a lack of attention. But how might reading develop? And I know this is, of course, the title of the book, but what about reading helps develop attention? Not just reading, but what does reading do for our attention span, for our, the neural networks in the brain, for how we think about the world, and how we can focus, and why do we need this? Maybe Julie, since you started on the fragmentation and distraction, if you wanna start on this question.
Oh, you greatly overestimate my knowledge of neural networks.
I said neural networks not because you talk about it, but just that was the first word that came to my brain. So
The
don't
first
worry
word
about,
that, yep.
yeah, don't worry
Yep.
about answering that.
Oh man, I think I want to start just by I don't know if this is quite reframing the question. A couple of times in the book, when we address especially the issue that, the idea that this is the most distracted age, you did mention, like Aristotle would have said this or that or the other thing. I think this is a perennial human problem. The need to be able to focus on something, to give our attention to something, and our constant, being pulled away from it by this or that or the other thing. I think it's helpful to think about the ways in which our current technologies and social media and whatever else are, extremely, they're just built to constantly harness our attention, right? I think there's part of the book we talk about the same mechanisms that make slot machines so addictive are also present in a lot of social media and apps and things like that. But I think acknowledging that this is also just a thing that a lot of people have written about for centuries allows you to avoid presentism. So you're not thinking we need to find new ways to solve these new problems. You think of, okay, what have people written in the past to address a similar problem, which of course brings you back to reading and to giving your attention to other people who have lived and considered the same questions before us. So yeah, that's I think how I would address that. Rachel, what do you want to add?
Cool.
Well, I'll just add. So we got a little preview of the questions, and I think we might get a chance to talk about practices a little more later. But I think a really good example from this section of the book is something that Julie kind of wrote about in, I think, chapter 1, which is this practice of lectio divina, this ancient way of reading a text. And so with the Bible, it is to kind of the point is you read the same passage several times and you kind of meditate on it and do specific things with it. And Julie has this really beautiful example of doing something similar in her classroom, where she asks students to kind of listen to a passage and kind of inhabit the text and think about what it means to be part of that. And so I think it's a really good example of how we can look to the past. A lot of our other practices are very modern, but many of them are indeed drawn from kind of Christian tradition from the past, and helping us to think deeply about important texts. It's something that humans have been trying to do for a long time, and sometimes we just need to be reminded of that.
So this one's not in the questions that I asked, but you do cover it in the book. And this is one of those things I imagine people are thinking, but is there a difference? And maybe talk about it specifically as professors for students who might struggle with this, between like a physical written word and then like an electronic presentation of the same thing. People assume if I'm on a Kindle, if I'm on an iPad, it's a different reading experience. that it's not going to lead to the same deep experience that maybe a physical word might, because there's more options to do it. If I read on my computer, this is different. You guys kind of talk about this in the book, but I'm just
Yeah.
curious for myself and for those listening, and maybe not just on the deep reading aspect, but in the like kind of availability for students and
Yeah.
some there's multitude of factors that come into this conversation. If you want to talk about that a little bit as well.
Ooh. Yeah. Do you mind, Julie, if I hop in for
Oh
a
yeah,
second?
please do.
Yeah.
These are the chapters Rachel was in charge of most.
Sure.
Yeah. So this is definitely something we talked a lot about as we were writing the book. And so there's a couple of things going on here. On the one hand, as someone who loves reading and loves texts, I tend to come down on the side of like any access to the text is better than no access to the text, right? So for my students, we thought a lot about this in the college context, right? Like, is it better that they buy the really expensive anthology, or is it better that they, can access the book online and
just
will
have
actually do it as opposed to not buying the expensive anthology, that kind of thing, right? And so in that way, kind of access to the text, and something I've tried to do with my students over the last couple of semesters is try to like not demonize things like audiobooks. Like that still counts as reading. When you listen to a book, that's still part of access to the text. On the other hand, I think there is, like for myself, I always prefer a physical text. And one of the things I've done with my students is I'll sometimes ask them questions about like, how do you read best? Or what do you notice about your attention? And overwhelmingly they say, when I have a physical book, I concentrate better, I take better notes, I am better able to do this. So there's this balancing act that I want my students to have access to as many amazing texts as possible. But I do think there is something formative about, well, anyway, maybe slightly differently formative about reading on a screen versus on a book. And I think you can access the goods of a text in both cases, but you might have to work a little harder on a screen, maybe. I don't know, Julie, if you have corrections or additions to add here.
No. I think the only thing that I would add is I'm similarly very, my parents listen to this, they're going to laugh. They bought me a Kindle probably 12 years ago that I never used.
I don't think anybody uses Kindle.
And now it's just, Rachel uses her Kindle, right? You're a
when
regular
I travel,
Kindle user.
Therefore, you're not just sitting in your Nook and reading a Kindle, nor are you reading a Nook from Barnes and Noble.
Does anyone, can you buy those still? Anyway,
they can't. They discontinued them. Yeah.
Oh, they discontinued it. Wow.
That way off topic, but Barnes and Noble, they had a huge renaissance like 3 years ago after COVID, and they're now like their stores are seeing record sales because they went away from the Nook and the digital presence. They like really stuck to their guns and said we're going to be a physical bookstore. But that's totally
so
off
interesting.
Topic.
This is also off topic, but I was just in Barnes and Noble last week, and the interplay between social media and physical bookstores is so fascinating to me because so many of the book tables, the corner, whatever you call it, things on the end caps. Yeah, or like book talk, all this stuff, and that was really interesting. But anyway, to go back on topic, I think the only thing I would add to what Rachel said was that, oh shoot, and I'm gonna lose it. There's something about, and we talk about this, I think, a little bit in chapter 1, when we're talking about temperance, is just like human limitedness. There's something about physical books. You can't have an endless library, an endless personal library, right? You physically can't if you have all physical books. You could if you were only accessing digital copies, but you would never get to all of them. And I think physical books, expensive anthologies do limit access to a lot of students, a lot of my students who buy, the digital text or use like Project Gutenberg or things like that in order. And I would much rather, like Rachel was saying, they have some kind of access to the text than to have no access to the text. But maybe I am just kind of a stick in the mud about some things.
So am I. Don't worry about it.
Rachel's laughing because she knows exactly how much of a stick in the mud I am about a lot of things. Um, I don't like reading a um a book. I don't like reading the Bible, especially on the same device that I use to like, watch cat videos, or something like that. It just strikes me as like
I get it. Yeah.
there's a dissonance there.
Yeah.
And there should be,
Huh.
if I'm going to really try to engage with something, if I'm going to respect the time and effort and history of something that I'm engaging with, I think I
Hmm.
want the means that I access it to maybe have some heft,
Yeah.
some literal heft.
The Cluhan,
Um,
the median is the message. There's a big,
yeah,
like, there's some reason why that's the case.
Yeah.
Neil Postman talks
yeah,
about this. Yeah, all like the media ecologists
yep,
will talk about the same thing.
yep. So yeah, I don't want to, especially, students who, it's another cost to add to their
Totally.
sheet of
Yep.
cost, right? But by the same token, what I would love is to have give students better access to more affordable textbooks, right? Instead of shunting
Yep.
students to digital books. But anyway,
Yep.
yeah.
No, that's a big deal. And that's I'm a preacher by trade. And one of the things that I stress is, and I know there's different things people eyesight may not allow for this or whatever it is, but the thing I stress is physical Bibles in church and as little media. Even like we don't have PowerPoint, we got nothing. It's just me with I print out my sermon that's not on an iPad. So it's like we try to drive. This is it, like you said, this is something embodied. Like there is something unique and in a sense holy about this. That like we are reading a physical text that was meant to be physical in a lot of ways. But that brings me to this next one, chapters 3 and 4, part 2 of this book. I'm gonna guess, me reading this, this is where a lot of Christians might fear a little bit. And I'm going to say that for both Christians and really progressive. So kind of, we'll say both very conservative and very progressive are going to bristle at these two chapters, but for different reasons. Because as everybody like, there's a like the book banning. There's all this stuff: book burning, book banning. You don't want to read across political lines. You don't want to read across ideological lines, culture divides, all that stuff. We read this so we can critique, or there's a fear of reading beyond certain boundaries because we might be infected. Like, oh, don't read that book because if you read that book, that's going to lead you to believe these kinds of things, or whatever it may be. So, why should we put the effort to read broadly? And how does this deepen our own selves and just beyond like a broad reading list? Like, why do we read broadly? What's the forming effect of reading broadly? Julie, if you want to start off on this one.
Sure. Um, so this reminded me of something that my advisor in grad school told me that I've never forgotten. I've forgotten some other things he's told me, but this one stuck. He said, if Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, then why should we fear any search for truth?
Mm-hmm.
Any prayerful, right, search for truth. So I think he's right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it
Augustine has a very
addresses both
similar
sides.
saying. It's
I'm
plundering
sure he
the
does.
gold
Yeah.
of Egypt. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. I think it addresses that, like both sides that you're talking about here, this just desire to critique or the fear that you'll be infected.
Yeah.
So if you acknowledge that Christ is Lord and source of all truth, and if you read broadly in prayerful desire for truth, then the idea that something might infect you just doesn't make sense in my
Yeah.
mind, because we're thinking about reading broadly as exposing ourselves not to infectious ideas, but to neighbors,
Mm-hmm.
especially those we might disagree with and those who might be able to teach us something. And if we acknowledge that Christ is the source of all truth and that we aren't,
Mm-hmm.
then our temptation to critique constantly looks less like faithfulness and it starts to look like a profound lack of humility, I think. So that's how I would, like to approach that kind of concern, I think.
Yeah. And maybe even before Rachel, if you want to add to this, and I don't use infection in a negative way, but like in some instance, like maybe you do need to be infected by differing things. Like there's some stuff that we
Yeah.
believe that may not be that great or very like much more culturally bound or ideologically bound than we think it is. So you
Yes.
do need to be infected in some way. And that's a fearful thing if you are so used to one expression of it that may not be the truth. It's based on the truth, We're not relativists, but we do believe that there is the truth, but there are cultural expressions of this that might have to be disabused in some way. So
Hmm.
it's good to be infected in this. So yeah, Rachel, what do you have to add on top of that?
Yeah, well, I'll just jump right off of what you were saying. There's a section, I think chapter 4, that our third co-author, Rachel, spent a lot of time on, which is about how you kind of distinguish cultural mores from good and evil.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
it's a really thoughtful section. I encourage people to look at that. She has a great example of a text she uses to kind of do this in her classes, and that kind of thing. So that kind of approach, I think, is helpful. And then this, like, the only other thing I'll add at the moment is that this falls under the section of the book that we called practices to subvert hostility.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
so and we did that on purpose, right? So that these ideas about reading broadly, um it, like, in some ways all the ideas in the book fit with all the vices, right? Like, you can talk about distraction, you can talk about consumerism with any of them, but we particularly wanted these two under hostility um because we can often treat ideas and books and people in a very hostile way
Yeah.
when we're afraid that they're going to teach us something that's bad, or that we'll have to admit that we're wrong, or any of these
Hmm.
difficult
Julie,
things,
we're
right?
never, or sorry, Rachel, we're never wrong. We have,
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I know,
I'm
I
never
know,
wrong.
right?
I got all
Yeah.
the
Not
truth on my
ever.
side.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, right? You get check off the list of the right things to believe, and you got it, right?
Yep.
Hmm.
And so the idea that we need to change the way we approach these things, and I think so in the chapters we lean a lot on empathy and then on prudence, which is being wise, right? And so approaching text just like we approach relationships, with prudence and with empathy and charity. Those are good guides for life, and they're also good guides for reading.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. So we'll dig into more some of this stuff too, practices in just a sec. But um, part three probably struck me the most because it's a conversation I've had. It's a conversation I'm probably talked about most when it comes to reading from congregants or members or whatever it is. Hey, can I read this or can I read that or whatever it may be. It's and I think Christians have as well. And there's a fear that if you read for enjoyment, you're wasting your time. That's because all reading must have a purpose. Like it must be. This is Westminster Shorter Catechism, question answer one. What is a what is a chief end of man? The end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. And if the reading we're doing is not doing that, then you're doing it wrong, or you're reading frivolous stuff. And get that out of your brain. Don't read for entertainment. Read for glory. So can you describe or talk about reading for enjoyment and how this grates against us, but why it's so good for us to just enjoy reading?
Yeah.
Rachel, I'll start
So
with you. You're the one
okay,
who
Yep.
yeah,
I felt like connected with that one the most.
yeah. Um, I mean, so I just uh, as I've said a couple of times, part of the reason we came to write this book is because of our deep love of reading,
Mhm,
and not just our deep love of things we learned from books, right? But our
mhm,
deep love of reading
mhm.
itself. It is fun and enjoyable and delightful, and so that is definitely part of the framework. Um, let's see, couple of concepts I'll throw out, and then I'll let Julie kind of dig into them a little more if she
Yep.
wants. So um, one of the chapters really particularly focuses on, I think it's 6, focuses on leisure,
Mhm,
and the idea of the
Mhm.
Sabbath, right? Which
mhm.
is, up there in the commandments, right?
Pretty big deal. Yep.
The idea of resting from our labors, of enjoying life,
Mhm.
and while the three of us happen to be people who get paid on some level to read, right? We
Yep.
we also
I get
read
paid to
because
read. Yep.
we enjoy it. It's really good. And then this is maybe not such a through line between the chapters. It's maybe not as obvious, but one of the through lines between the chapters is the idea of community. Um, enjoy reading books on my own, but it is most fun and enjoyable to me when I read them and I talk about them with people. Like, that's when I really see the humor. That's when I really see um, the value in some of these texts. It's part of why I'm a teacher. And
Mhm.
so, you know, part of reading for enjoyment is reading to share ideas with others. And honestly, that takes longer. It takes longer to do stuff with others than it does to do it by myself most of the time. But it's worth it. It's worth it to take the longer road so that you can have fun with your reading.
Yeah, wait to add on before Julie. Sorry, there's two authors I've been reading more recently. One's on a modern author. She's 200 years old. She's dead. And the other one's Amor Towles. If you've heard of Amor Towles, his trilogy. It's a Rules to Civility is his first one. That was like 2012, and then a Gentleman in Moscow, which was just that was just made by Paramount Plus in a series. It is the best book I've ever read in my entire life. And I just enjoyed the heck out of it when I read it. And it wasn't like I have to do schoolwork for this. That's not going to make it my sermon. It's just like he's just a tremendously gifted writer who, like, when he writes, you're just like, I can't not read this and enjoy this. And then Anne Bronte, I've been reading her. What's it called? It's Tenet of Wildfell Hall, which is such a gorgeous book. Holy moly, is she a good writer? But it's just like, I'm not doing this for a sermon, or it's not going to make it in an illustration. They're just so stinking fun to read. But yeah, sorry, Rachel, it was just a tangent of my own. Julie, whatever you want to add to that.
The number of times that, Rachel and I in particular have like texted each other, say, have you read this book? This is a really good book. Yep. And our writing group meetings for a long time, right, concluded with, what are you reading right now? And we would share what we had been reading and how much we've been enjoying that. Yep. But to add to what Rachel was saying, I'm going to talk about another book. So if you haven't read Robert Capen's The Supper of the Lamb before.
I've heard of it. I've never read it. But I've heard of it.
I read your question and I was like, oh, this makes me think not only of our book, which of course everyone should read, but of
whether for entertainment or for a purpose, whatever you want to do.
Right. But it's kind of I wrote in my notes, an avuncular theology of eating and drinking, which is kind of what it is. So he's talking about food, and he makes the point that God did not have to make food taste good.
No.
At all. Zero reason for that. That he calls, in the Genesis creation narratives, that he calls it good instead of useful, right? And even when you quoted the Catechism, right, the enjoyment of God, right, is what we're called to do, and not be useful for him. So I just think a lot about that. He created things that are good, not because or just because they are useful. And that's one of the ways I think we bear the image of God, is by enjoying those good things he's made for themselves, because they are good. Because, I don't know, an onion is perfectly crafted to fall apart in a certain way when you cut it. He has a whole chapter about onions.
Yeah, and make you cry.
You know?
Exactly.
And make you cry, right? Or that when you peel an orange, that smell just sparks. It doesn't need to do that, right?
No.
So yeah, we are enjoying God by enjoying the things that he's made, and acting as sub-creators by making good things and enjoying those things as well, right? And among the things that we create are stories and books. So there you go.
That's true. It reminds me of, you might have heard of Tish Harrison Warren. Her book Liturgy of the Ordinary goes through a lot of the same stuff. The embodiedness of some of these things, and the regular stuff, tangible stuff that we forget about, but is part of our enjoyment of who God is and what he's done for us. And that's really important, because I think a lot of Christians, like, we don't realize it, but like, we're kind of like Gnostics through and through. It's just the body's not real, the paper's not real, like none of this stuff is real. We're just waiting for God to catch us up into the sky and take us out and rapture us. But it misses like you said, the enjoyment of this world that he has created. Yes, it's under sin, but it's still enjoyable. There's still a lot of stuff that we can enjoy and enjoy God through it. Cool. So I've left this off intentionally until we kind of built a base up. But all throughout this book, you talk about practices towards deeper reading in your own lives and as professors in your students' lives, the classrooms that you lead, the students that you teach. So, and I know we've gone through a lot, but maybe just some general practices you talk about in the book that readers can kind of take grab of and say, I can practice these in my life. So what are some practices, what are some habits we can inhabit for and towards deeper reading?
I'll go first on this one.
Go for it.
Reading aloud is what I wrote in my notes with an exclamation point. Like reading aloud.
Can I just say I
Read.
like that you have notes for that
Yes,
so rarely happens whenever I
we
send
both do
questions.
probably.
Yeah, this is awesome. You guys are truly English professors that you have notes on the questions. I like it.
Yeah, so I would have been absolutely. I'm already stumbling over my words. If I didn't have notes, it would have been so much worse.
Yeah, that's why I send
But
questions
yeah,
over. So, or else I will be scatterbrained.
yep, yep. Reasons for lesson plans too, right? But yeah, reading aloud, I think, is a practice that is, yeah, part of it. We talk about it in the first chapter as a way to subvert distraction, or resist distraction, because you can't. You've got to be focused on the text as you're reading it aloud. But also, some things are just so fun when read aloud, or they hit differently, or it can help um, people you are reading with to better understand that text. I think about how much trouble my students have sometimes with poetry,
Hmm.
especially with enjambment, right? When the line continues, the thought continues past the end of a line.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I don't make my students read aloud, and I would never, attach someone's grade to something so anxiety producing. But just chewing on the text, I think, is so
Yeah.
important. I try to do it with scripture sometimes too,
Mhm.
and it helps with your memory as well, and um, it gives me a bigger sense that there's a person who wrote this, right? Someone who thought these words and probably spoke them aloud to him or herself as well. So that's the main one I would say.
I like it. Yeah. To add a point to that, I love I went to Westminster Seminary, California, and they're big proponents of the original languages. And so Greek and Hebrew were all throughout
Mhm.
our program. You couldn't touch an English Bible, it was all Greek and Hebrew. And the thing that our professors always made us do, and like I understood then, but I definitely understand now that I'm preaching, it's we were forced to read out the Hebrew, whether it be
Mhm.
poetry, whether it be narrative, in Greek, and especially kind of in more it's hard to say, like vocal text, like the book of Hebrews
Mhm.
it's a vocal text, and that was when we noticed like the alliteration that the language would use, the like the verbal assonance between different stuff, the what they call homoioteleton, which is just the ending sounds the same as the next line's ending. But yeah, there's something really, really, really formative and interesting when you read it out loud, and like you notice what the author was doing just beyond the words on the page. That there's a reason why this word says this or sounds like this next to that word. Cool.
Mhm.
Yeah, Rachel, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm gonna call out two practices that I did not do before we wrote this book. So these are things
Hmm,
that I learned about from Julie and Rachel that I have consciously tried. And so these are both gonna sound like, well, they are gonna be examples for my teaching, but I think these are
awesome.
both things that could carry over.
Yeah.
So one of them, I think in the book, the section's called something like diving deep, and it's essentially looking at a smaller portion of text than you normally do.
Yep.
So normally in my literature classes, they're often surveys. We're trying to get through a lot of material, and so we go kind of big questions. What's the main idea? What are some of these things? And a couple of times this semester, in my literature class, I said, okay, never mind all that. Today we are going to read one poem.
Hmm.
And I know you read 10 poems to get ready for this class, but we're just going to look at one of them today.
Mhm.
And the part of me that likes checklists was really worried about how that was going to go. But it was so lovely to just not feel like we had to rush, to just look at this one beautiful piece of literature, um, and kind of wait and see what appeared. And so, like I said, that's a teaching example, but I think it's something that anyone could do, whether you're part of a book group, right? You could say, let's just focus on this part. Or by yourself. I'm not going to read this whole book of poems. I'm going to read 3 poems, and I'm just gonna spend some time with them. Um, that is not natural for many of us, but I found it really, really valuable.
Hmm.
And then the other one is one that our third co-author, Rachel, does with her students, which is she kind of ties them together, communal reading and using reading logs. So we had a class this semester where we just went to the library and read our novels that we were supposed to discuss the next week in class. So we just found a place to sit and we read. And then I also, at various times, including that day, had them keep track of like how many pages they read, whether they stopped to do anything else besides read, how long it took them, those kinds of things. And the feedback I got from my students about both of those things was really positive. Like they really appreciated the kind of accountability, right, of both of those things. And again, I think those are things that you could do, you know, outside the classroom setting as well as inside, right? You could just get together with friends and read. You could log your own reading, not so that you know how fast you read, right? But so that you can see how your attention span grows, how you know, how often you return to a particular text, these kinds of things. And so anyway, that was a really long answer to your question, but those are two things that like I didn't do before Julie and Rachel introduced them to me. I have loved them. I will probably do some version of them in my classes for the foreseeable future because these are really valuable, informative things.
That's cool. Yeah, and for those who are listening, there's more practices that are written down in this book. As if you want more, then you're gonna have to buy the book and read the book and figure out what those practices are. So thanks for whetting their appetite, whetting my appetite as well, because I know the practices, but those who haven't bought the book don't know the practices. So buy the book. So last question, and again, I'll start with who I started with at the beginning. I'll start with Julie on this one, and then go to Rachel. So we've talked about a lot, and maybe if you can elevator pitch for a student, for not even just a student, but somebody who's just well past their school age, and they're like, but why should I be reading? What good is it for me now that I'm not a student any longer? What's your hope for those who read your book? Because it's likely, I'm sure professors and students are going to use it. It's likely going to be read by people who are no longer students. So talk to the no longer student for your hope for them in this book.
It's here where I tell you that I'm terrible at elevator pitches. Is anyone good at them? I think I would come back first to the idea of community, because this is something, we wrote this book in community, right? We read it back with each other in community. It became a better book because we were all working on it together. The book was also formed like by a community of all of the authors that we cite and otherwise, you know, mention, or the other things that we've read that wormed their way into our minds and hearts and into this book. Yeah, that reading will connect you to other people, both the people you are reading about, the people whose works you are reading, and the people you are reading with. And I think that is incredibly important and rewarding. And I wrote down that reading is very difficult and you should do it anyway, is what I have in my notes to do this well.
It is true. I think your average adult reads less than 2 books a year, so it's pretty darn hard to do.
Oh boy. And I think that maybe the third part of the elevator pitch is that if you are a Christian, your faith, your tradition is built on a text and your understanding of that text. And it is so rewarding, I think, and necessary to go beyond like the life verse approach to reading scripture, right?
Yep.
And toward actually understanding, if going back to relationship, right? If you are cultivating a relationship with God, or if God is cultivating a relationship with you, I know this is a good Calvinist podcast. I'm a good Calvinist.
Yeah, good catch. Yeah.
Yep. Then that's one of the ways in which that relationship is cultivated, is your deep reading of scripture. So yeah.
Amen. Yeah. I'm not a fan of the atomistic or life verse, but like the broad sweep of redemptive history, how that forms and shapes you versus single verses. Yeah. Rachel, what about you? What's your hope?
my hope, there's some overlap with Julie, which is good because we wrote the book together. But
Makes sense, yep.
the things that I have in my notes are, my hope is that people will not only read the book, but will try out at least a couple of the practices.
Cool.
It is easy to read
Yeah.
and then put on the shelf and then not do anything with. So I hope people will try some of them. Maybe you'll hate them. Sorry. I mean, I don't know. I was raised Calvinist. You can expect some depravity in all things.
Yep.
So,
Life is pain.
just, maybe it'll be terrible, but I don't think it's gonna be. I think you're gonna
No,
find
I don't think so
something
either.
that is beautiful, informative. And then to go back to Julie's first point, the kind of I wrote this down several times in my notes. If I had to pick one thing to summarize what I want to say in the book, it's don't read alone.
Mhm.
And that, that doesn't
Mhm.
mean you should never be by yourself while reading a book, but in
Yeah.
general, like, we should read with other people. We
Yeah.
should read thinking about other people. We should read and talk about things we read with other people. And I hope that this book gives people a way to do that more.
Yeah.
To read with others as part of a reading community.
Yeah, and read with people that you agree with and that you disagree with, because then you'll have a lot more interesting conversations
Yep,
and perspectives on text that you never thought possible,
absolutely.
and help your own perspective. Cool.
Yep.
This is how some of our meetings about the book went, actually. We were
Okay.
hashing out ideas.
There are several passages, I won't reveal them, but there are several passages that are the result of much compromise between the three of us, which is good. It's a better book because of it.
Yeah, that's it. It makes the book
Yes.
better. It makes you guys better after having written the book together.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a big deal, and I think I hope those who read this book, and people disagree with points, but it does force you, like you say, to read with those who will disagree with you. Read books that you'll disagree, and read books that you'll agree with, but are just entertained by. Whatever it is, and that's part of, I think, the purpose of this book is to say, like, this is kind of how Christians have been reading for a long time, or at least modern Christians, and let's maybe not read that same way, and let's see a broader way of reading that helps informs us, like you just said, instead of just people in my tribe. Let's read people in my tribe. Well, Rachel and Julie, thank you so much for coming on, for writing this book, as well as the other Rachel who couldn't make it on this show. But I thank you for reading this book, or for writing this book and reading this book, for writing this book, and for sharing it with me and with our audience as well. And not just as a worldview shaping thing, but as people shaping things. Thank you for coming on and talking about your book.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.